All right, thank you. I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch. Now we can take a nap. All right. Our next guest is a senior prosecutor in charge for the Pennsylvania Department of State. Since 2012, Ray has been a senior prosecutor with the Department of State, supervising a team of 8 to 12 prosecutors, prosecuting attorneys, plus legal support staff, handling all disciplinary and application matters for multiple high complexity health business related licensing and commissions, including pharmacy, funeral, engineering, land surveying, architecture, and of course, real estate. Please welcome none other than Ray Michalowski, again, senior prosecutor in charge for the Pennsylvania Department of State. And if you don't welcome him, you will be in trouble. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I coming through on the mic? Excellent. You may have death by PowerPoint. The PowerPoint slides really are as much for me to be guided as what I'm talking about. I like for this to be conversational. So if somebody has a question, if that's okay with our folks who are doing this, I'd like to have a conversation about what we're talking about today. Let's see, I've got a clicker here. Let's see if it works.
Excuse me, let me
Sure.
An extra mic for people who are asking questions.
Absolutely.
Thank
There's
you.
one right here.
Thank you, I'm sorry.
Thank you. And it's a title slide. I'm an attorney, so everything starts with a disclaimer. Essentially what our boards do not have the ability to give advisory opinions. That's why we have the prosecutors out here. We're speaking from experience, what we've seen in the past, what I'm seeing a lot in other states, nationally. So what I'm doing today is a big overview, a catch on appraisal bias, which has been in the news all the time lately. And a lot of articles that I've seen are just really things that are regurgitating previous articles as clickbait. So I'm hopefully was able to pull together some of the more important things for you to learn. But again, this is an opinion, this is my experience being presented to you, and I'd like to learn more experience by having questions asked or conversations with the folks in the audience. Let's see. Okay, we're not going forward. There we go. So the learning objectives in this course, and trying to keep it, we have 45 minutes. I'd like to have a conversation with you as well. So first I'm going to start with what is a real estate appraisal? Everybody's paid for one or had one done or heard about them. What really is it and what isn't it? We'll go over that to begin with. And also, what are the sources of appraisal bias? What is appraisal bias? We talk about it a lot in the news. We talk about it in every meeting. Tomorrow, the State Board of Certified Real Estate Appraisers, the folks I'm sort of representing here today, are meeting. They meet virtually, by the way, so I would invite you to go on the Department of State's website, and I can even help you get there. Everything is virtual now since COVID. We do in-person, so it's hybrid. But any part of the state, you don't need to leave your chair, and you can attend a meeting. And this is a subject that comes up at every one of this board's meetings. They're an excellent board. More towards the end, I'm going to talk about how to spot suspected appraiser bias. And by that point, hopefully I've tied a bunch of things in for you so you'll know what appraiser bias is versus appraisal bias. They're interconnected things, but they're not exactly the same thing. And only one of them is what I work with as far as enforcement goes. And then the last one is to understand what actions the state and federal authorities responsible for this are taking to address the issues of appraisal and appraiser bias. Having trouble going forward again? Oh, wait, no, I went too far. Okay, so what is a real estate appraisal? So I'm an attorney, so I'm going to look for the legal definition in Pennsylvania. It's boring, but it's a written analysis, opinion, or conclusion relating to the nature of law. You can read it there. It is a determination, typically, most common one you will see is of the monetary value of a property, a piece of real estate. It could be vacant land, it can be a commercial building, but we're most often going to be here talking about residential properties. There's a couple of levels of appraiser, and the lower level is ones that can do only residential. That's the most common appraisal you will see. So we'll kind of stick to that for the day. What is not a real estate appraisal? Who here has been on Zillow or Redfin or any of those other sites that have all the real estate stuff, or a realtor's own site? The most common thing you'll see on Zillow that is not an appraisal, but that will tell you the alleged value of your house, is their Zestimate. It's an automated valuation model. Automated valuation models are excluded from the Act. There's really no rules about what goes into those, who creates the algorithms, or what data they use. But those are very common. They're kind of convenient. They're neat. I've looked at the Zestimate my house. I do it probably every 2 months. And I wonder why my house, via the Zestimate, is worth less than the two condos on the next to mine. Like, what do they know about my house that they don't, and about those houses? But probably is mine is not sold as recently, so they have less data. And then our real estate agents in Pennsylvania, which are under a different licensing board and commission. In fact, by law, they have to be under a different licensing board and commission, can do things called comparative market analysis and broker price opinions. Those are for limited purposes to help you. The most common one you do as a consumer is to help you price a house for sale if you're selling your house, or if you're making an offer on a house, try and figure out what kind of an offer to make sure your agent may go and do some work. It's not required to be at the level that an appraiser does. They don't have the same level of education. They do have to have some education on appraisal, and they do have to have at least 3 years of experience in the field to do at least a broker price opinion. Comparative market analysis, they can do right out of school. That's really just to sort of ballpark, based on their experience, what they think you should list a house for, or what you might want to offer for. And in this market, every time you try that, it's probably higher than it was anyway. So those are not appraisals. Appraisals are things that are required, that first definition I gave you, but they have to be performed by a licensed appraiser. I'm going to get this at the end, which kind of end like I'm not a positive, but appraisers have to do a ton of education and then even further time as what essentially is an apprentice. We call it a licensed trainee, but you have to get a lot of, if you look back at the old ways of doing things, you had to become an apprentice before you became a master or a journeyman. They have to spend a lot of time as an apprentice or assistant gathering several thousand hours of practical and increasingly complex experience before they can even sit for the test. That's what a difference between an appraiser and the 3 or 4 hours of education that a real estate agent might have. I've been doing this work for a number of years, as you heard. I could not possibly do an appraisal. I could look at one, I can look for things I might know be wrong in it, but that doesn't mean I could even ever hope to do an appraisal. So what role do appraisals play in the mortgage process? First of all, if you had, who in here has bought a home, had a home purchased from them, and when you buy a home, you pay for the appraisal. It's on the closing sheet. Usually you pay out of pocket before you even get to closing, if you're the buyer. And yet, here's the weird thing, you're not their client. In most cases, the client is the lender. And we get a lot of complaints in our office that the appraiser won't give us a copy of it. Well, if the lender is required to give you a copy. So if you just go to the lender, who the appraiser is working for, they will give you a copy of it. So that's one very practical piece of information hopefully you pick up today. But when they're valuing a piece of property, especially in a lending capacity, what will happen if that property gets foreclosed on? We all lived through the 2007, 8, 9 crash. I changed jobs during that time because I knew that crash was coming, and I was in a law firm that was very real estate heavy. What place better to be than where we'd be cleaning up after it at the state, going after all the folks that caused the crash? They're looking to see that the bank is protected. You know, they generally loan at a loan-to-value ratio. Back in the 2000s, it was 100% loan. Now getting above 80% of the value is very difficult. So the appraisal will determine the value of the property, and then loans typically will lend you up to 80% of that value. So determining that value is very important. The lenders are looking to protect themselves if they have to sell this house in foreclosure or some other pre-foreclosure proceeding, which there are many now. And of course, you're looking not to overpay. I see a lot of things in the market. The market is very hot right now. I see a lot of cases in the market where people are even waiving the appraisal. They don't care what the appraisal says as far as buyers and sellers go. They're going to buy that house for the price they're putting down because in an uprising market, when you're setting the newest highs, the appraisals look at data that already exists. So in a market like we're in today, where the prices keep going up and up and up, there's a little dip right now because of the mortgage rates, but they had been going up pretty steadily with a limited number of things to buy on the market. Appraisers are not going to typically get that high price because they're looking at the trailing data. It'll flip if the market were to go down, same thing happens. It takes a while for the data to catch up sometimes in a rapidly rising or falling market. Let's see here. I'm sure we're getting to the next slide. And a little paranoid if I do, too many times I'll get 3 slides ahead. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the appraisals work under national appraisal standards. So the appraisal industry as itself was really required to be born after not the 2008-9, 79 crash, but if you're old enough like I am, you remember the savings and loan crash at the end of the 80s. So the appraisal board itself in Pennsylvania has only existed since the early 90s. Before that, most of the appraisers were realtors under the Real Estate Commission. After the savings and loan crash said, we need to fix this, we need to separate out these two professions to the point that we have 29 licensing boards and professions where I work. The commissioner of our agency is a de facto member of 28 of those. The one he is not a member of, the appraiser board, because the appraiser board and a real estate commission in any state cannot have any 2 members in common. So we have to have somebody else designated by the Secretary of State to sit on the board in their place. There has to be complete separation, and that was the thing that occurred after the savings and loan scandal, and it has been strengthened since the crash of the late 2000s after the Dodd-Frank legislation went through. So when this first came up, they created the Universal Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice. If you read any articles on this, you'll just see it referred to as USPAP. USPAP, that's what we all call it. I called it that for years. I even defended cases with realtors before I became a senior prosecutor or a prosecutor. I was in private practice on the other side of the table, handling cases against real estate agents and appraisers. And I really had no idea what USPAP even meant. I knew the word, I knew to talk about it until I came down, took a bunch of classes on it, read a bunch of expert reports. I'm still not sure I know 100% what it is. It's sort of a code of ethics in a way, but also some technical guidelines that don't really have how to perform an appraisal in them. They need you to take all of the theory and all the economics and all the real estate and all the things you learn in the other classes. And the USPAP basically says, here's the way you report those. Here's what you can say, here's what you can't say, here's what you must say in some cases. It's created by the Appraisal Foundation was created by Congress after the S&L crisis. It used to be updated every year. Now it's really every 2, might be every 3 years by the time they get the next update out. One of the reasons being the next update, they're very concerned about working on improving issues related to appraisal bias. The Appraisal Foundation also sets minimum standards for training education of our appraisers, which the state can go above, we can't go below. I have a question.
Quick question. Are there any closing costs that are illegal, that's commonly levied? And is there any thoughts about addressing runaway closing fees?
So closing costs are typically under the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, is the one act I can think that, and they would say federal act, RESPA. We have all the acronyms where I work, trust me. Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, and every time something like that comes up, they'll usually add something to RESPA. Appraisals used to cost, before the crash, between $250 to $350. They're a lot higher now, not only because of inflation, like we see everything going up, but because after the crash in 2000, they created something called appraisal management companies, which are supposed to be somewhere to prevent a different kind of bias, to prevent bias on the high side where lenders were giving the appraiser their assignment. And if you didn't get the number that they wanted to lend, because the lenders back then really wanted to lend money, because they lend it to you and they sold the note the next day. There was a lot of feeling there was a lot of undue influence when your employer, your contracted employer, is not going to use you if you don't get the number they want. So that fee has created an increase in appraisal fees because now the appraisal fee is part to the appraiser, part to the appraisal management company, which ironically now most of them are owned by the banks. Not directly, but within a few things. But as far as any other issues with settlement costs, I'm not aware of any major trends in those. I know there's a lot of added fees. I don't know that any of them are currently illegal. But again, if they were to address those either at the state or federal level, there might be some reining in. I know title insurance is set. Title insurance is set by the state. It's a fee that you pay for the insurance, which again, mostly insures the lender, not you. But other than that one being set by the state and the rate being set, I'm not sure what's out there now. If there's anything specific that anyone wants to ask about, I can certainly address it. But I can tell you where the cost for appraisals went up because of the appraisal management companies, which are supposed to act as an intermediary, questionable whether they do or not. Move on to the next slide, which works sometimes and sometimes doesn't. Okay, just going really quickly. The appraiser board, as I was talking about, was created after the requirement that you have one. If we don't have an appraiser board in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania will be prohibited from doing any lending that's federally backed. When you're talking about residential mortgages, that's almost all of them. So if this appraisal board is not functioning at the way that it's set up by the feds, so we're federally affected, we're going to be audited again in August. We get audited every 2 years with a mini audit in between, although COVID kind of messed that up a little bit. If we were to fail that audit, we would not be able to do any mortgage lending in Pennsylvania, which would be pretty dang disastrous to the economy as a whole. The appraiser board consists of mostly appraisers. They just added a number of assessors, which is different. Those are the folks who work for the counties assessing the values of the houses. There's also a banking member. That person was added after the crash, so there was some of the banking background on there, and some public members as well. So what is appraisal bias? I've been teaching the last couple of weeks at the request of appraisal associations to come and talk to them, not just about appraisal bias, but about things we're seeing in the field. And so I asked this question at the 2 meetings I had, which was rooms full of appraisers, including some people I've known for many years, other ones I've never met before, some experts in the field, other ones who I'm sure may be expert, but I don't know what they do. And I asked everybody, I said, have you ever performed an appraisal that was affected by appraisal bias? And 99% of them raised their hand. That was a powerful thing because it means that they're aware of what's out there in the news and they're aware of what's going on that will affect their appraisal in some ways they cannot help. And that's, again, we're going to get to the difference of what's appraisal bias versus appraiser bias, which is what I can deal with. But USPAP, the standards, has always had a requirement. You cannot have bias in an appraisal. Now, when you talk about appraisal bias in the media right now, we're talking about appraisal bias in the fair housing context. Okay, but you can't have bias of any means. We had a case we prosecuted an expert that worked for us. So we were the client. And they didn't tell us that they had been in a business dispute with somebody they did an expert report on. Clearly, a very great potential for bias. We found that out at the last minute. It was kind of a nightmare. But our own expert ended up in front of us being prosecuted for committing bias. It wasn't a protected class of any sort, but bias has always been a part of USPAP. USPAP, really, the 3 biggest words in USPAP are that the report has to be credible, which means worthy of belief, has to be supported. So appraisers give an appraisal. You can get a copy of the appraisal. They also have to have a work file. The work file is everything they looked at, all the data they relied on to create the appraisal. And the whole thing should be like I could rebuild the appraisal from the work file. And they're required to keep that for 5 years, just like they keep the appraisal. So supported, credible, and it has to be objective. And objectivity goes to bias. So it's nothing new in the field. They know they have to, and appraisers, when approached with appraisal bias, get defensive at times, and yet want to learn all the time. So it's a very interesting dynamic when I've been out teaching in the last couple of weeks. They've been asking me to come and talk about these things. And as we get to the end, I'll talk about how education is really what we're trying to go forward with most. So appraiser bias, again, I deal with the appraisers, is one aspect of appraisal bias. If you read some of the articles out there, especially the ones that are just aggregating and clickbaiting pieces of other articles, it'll make it sound like we have an army of very discriminatory appraisers out there just trying to not let folks who are in a protected class, or sometimes just in a class that's not even related to protected class, not buy a house. I really don't think that's true. I definitely think it happens, and we'll talk about some of those cases. But there are also issues with appraisal bias, because appraisals are based on historical data, what I just talked about. And I caught a little bit at the lunchtime presentation where they talked a little bit about something I want to talk about next, which is redlining. There are tons of sources of historical discrimination in real estate, from restrictive covenants that would prohibit the ownership of properties in a neighborhood that could be owned by a black person, all sorts of things that have happened over the years. But redlining is the most common one that people talk about. So what was redlining? Redlining were maps, generally of larger cities, though I'm sure it occurred everywhere. But the most commonly known are maps of larger cities where the folks identified areas that were high risk for lending. What did high risk mean? High risk meant generally lower socioeconomic classes, folks who didn't have a lot of money. Now, statistics, I get some arguments with this. If you look at the statistics, the people who lived in the redlined areas of the cities, between 80 and 85% of them were white. But if you look at the city as a whole, the folks who lived in the redline districts was 90 to 95% of the people of color. So while there were a lot of white folks in that area, it was a concentration of the people of color within the city. I'll show you a map when we get back here from the 30s, but one of the things somebody asked me here in a meeting a couple weeks ago, like, redlining is just historic. Philadelphia is a historic city. Why is Philadelphia here? Why is there a museum here? Because Philadelphia has always been here. History always plays forward. And that's one of the things I've been trying to teach. So redline areas were basically either they wouldn't loan to you or they would loan to you at exorbitant rates. So you had redlining, and here's a map from 1937, and literally the parts in red are the parts where they would essentially say, we should not lend to, or very, very, very selectively lend. It's just picking a place. If you lived in those places, that's a place where they were not going to lend. And if you can't get a loan to buy or sell your house, it's going to depress the value of the neighborhood, of the property, because you're either going to have to do it by a cash sale, which is much more difficult, or worse, maybe I missed it here. Oh, the reverse redlining, which is on this side. Reverse line. So what happens when you have an area like the bottom of this slide where there's all these red areas where the big lenders will not lend? The predatory lenders come in at super high rates. I grew up in a little Appalachian sort of town in north central PA, and we had banks there, but we also always had these places, these lenders that a lot of people went to. My family went to them. And the rates, I didn't even know at this point, they were very high. These were what they call soft money lenders. And it was an area where right now you could I drive a 2016 Honda Pilot that I bought used. I paid more for that car, I'm still paying for it, than I would for a house in the town I grew up in. Again, an area that's also affected by this. They were not redlined because there weren't maps, but they were socioeconomic risks. It was a dying area, an old coal town. But in a larger city, it would be sectioned. And in those sections, it prevents people from buying and selling houses for their actual worth or increasing the worth, which decreases generational wealth. Because real estate is one of the great sources of generational wealth. out there. So if your house is not increasing in value, and you end up with the 1960s, we have the Housing Act of 1968, because some of those maps at that point were being used by the government. They were governmental maps for lending. After 1968, they weren't, and then we had the Fair Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. These are just a number of the acts that occurred during the civil rights period and after that were addressing housing bias. So yes, the government stopped using them. Does that mean that they actually stopped using? This is a question I did. Redlining hasn't existed since 1968 because we have that act. So I just pulled the most recent one that affected this area, 2015 settlement with Hudson City Savings Bank, which covered parts of New York, parts of New Jersey, and the Philadelphia and other parts of other regions in South Central PA. They ended up paying $27 million because they were found to be effectively redlining. That's 2015. That's a lot of years past 2064. And we just had one in 2023, a settlement with the Department of Justice. It was not in this region, that's why I didn't put it on there. I thought there's a little more accurate. Was in California, one of the most, considered a very liberal state where there's less discrimination. No, the last one was just this year with a small regional bank out there that was practicing redlining behind the scenes. So there aren't redline maps out there that appraisers use, but how can redlining historically depressing the value of houses in an area, real estate area, how can that not affect everything going forward? Because remember I told you, they depend on data. And these things don't happen, they didn't disappear in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, the practices. So the systemic sources of bias. When we make an appraiser do an appraisal, they have to follow certain rules. They have to follow the rules of the use PAP. The person sending them the assignment will have their own rules. Most of those rules also end up back with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, especially Fannie Mae is the current one, the federal backer of all. And this I took from the Fannie Mae Selling Guide, and it's kind of a boring piece when you get down to the bottom. It says comparable sales from within the same neighborhood, including subdivision, as the subject property should be used when possible. So if you have an area that has been historically undervalued because of all of these issues, redlining and all the rest, being cut off because of, I didn't understand growing up, what did the other side of the tracks mean? I learned that when I went into Erie, driving around with a housing advocate who was helping me with an appraisal case many years ago, and he explained that what that meant was when the railroads came in, and especially when the interstates came in, whole neighborhoods, usually minority-majority neighborhoods, were cut off. And that's what the other side of the tracks meant. It didn't mean they just didn't like the railroad, it's that isolated neighborhood. So that's, redlining, infrastructure improvements back in the day that they didn't take into account what they might be doing to neighborhoods. So many other things have historically depressed values. But if a neighborhood is depressed, and I saw there was a presentation earlier on gentrification, which is a tricky subject. So you gentrify an area and improve an area, great. If you improve it too much, too fast, what happens? Everybody living there has to move out, and people with a lot more money move in. So you're not helping anybody that's in that area if you don't do it in a carefully thought out area. And I'm sad I missed the presentation because I think that would have been a great one that I would have learned a lot from. I'll try and catch it again sometime in the future. But gentrification, yes, the neighborhood's now improved, lending is now improved for that area, but does it really affect the folks who were affected by what happened before? Not if it's not done in a careful and considerate way. But we make the appraisers not go far afield. They can't become a social justice warrior and say, I see houses in this part of the city, there's ones in the other part of the city that look exactly like these, except that part of the city has gentrified, and the values are higher there now. They can't do that. So an appraiser, even if they wanted to try and do something of that sort, the system makes them work within the neighborhood, within the locality, unless they can go through a lot of hoops. And they're very worried because they go too far afield, we're gonna look at them like, oh, you're trying to get a higher price, because that's what appraisers who are trying to get an illegally higher price would do. They'll go and search for them as far away as they can. Or are you committing appraisal bias by going out of the neighborhood? We're gonna talk about that in a moment. See if I can get that. But so the way appraisals are done, that's why everybody raised their hand when I asked that question. Have you performed an appraisal that was affected by appraisal bias? They all raised their hands because they knew all of these things. They knew that the reputation of a neighborhood, the historical values within that neighborhood are very, very limiting for them as an appraiser. If nobody's buying houses in that neighborhood at a price similar to one half a mile away, a quarter mile away, that has a different reputation, has been gentrified. In Pennsylvania, I'm not sure about the Philadelphia market, I don't know as well, but in the rest of Pennsylvania, what is usually the biggest selling point for a house? Exactly, you got it all. I heard several people say, it's the school district. And we just had a court case coming down talking about the inequalities in funding of schools. So there's a lot of systemic things out there that the appraisers can't do anything about because they're dealing with the neighborhood they're dealing with. And again, if we look at them going too far afield, the rules say don't do that. So if you're looking for possible appraiser bias, and this does occur. So now we're talking about the people I do. When does appraiser bias occur? I think the vast majority of complaints I've had over the years have been, this person didn't like me, they saw what color I was. Actually, I had a number of cases where people were complaining because they were in an LGBTQ relationship, and they were pretty sure the person was against them because of that. And that's why the appraisal came out low. There's a lot of reasons an appraisal came out low. It could be things that are very technical, or it could just be a bad appraisal. But one thing that I could not find in the LGBT community that I could find for evidence with people of color and other protected classes are, where did they pick their comps from? So if you look at the cases that are in the news, the Marin City, California case, the JP Morgan case, the one down in Maryland, which is very prominent right now. In each of those cases, I wondered, why did they take that? Maybe it was just a bad appraisal. We have people who just do bad appraisals. That's what my job is to find the people who do bad appraisals and either educate them or revoke them. Either get them to be better or get them to leave the field. Hopefully the first, not the last. We don't want to get rid of anyone we don't have to. But why would an attorney take these cases? Because somebody saw the house, appraised it very low. They had another appraiser come in after they removed all of the identifying information, all of the identifying things that might show that it's an African-American or mixed race family, and then had a white homeowner greet them at the door. But another appraiser came in and did it. And I'm a scientist by background. Like, there's no scientific proof there. But I looked into these cases, and what they were looking for is, where did they pick the comps? We should evaluate the property, not the people. And what in several of these cases you would find is that they went to areas nearby or a little farther away in the one case, where the properties didn't match the property as well, but the racial makeup of the neighborhood they were going to for their comparable properties, which is how you determine how much this house is worth, how much are houses like it selling. They went to areas that could be identified as being more matched to the owner of the house than to the house itself. And so that's a big thing. That's a difference between appraisal bias that affects the neighborhood and appraiser bias. Because I moved out of the little town I grew up in, and I didn't take any of those discriminatory things with me. You wouldn't have known that. I could have told you I was born anywhere. You would have known that I was born in a town where real estate markets are so low that, again, my car costs more than most of the houses there. I can leave there, nobody's going to see. Appraiser bias is the worry we have when you're not in a neighborhood that's being, again, I think the larger issue with appraiser bias really affects neighborhoods, it affects large swaths of places, it goes back historically and systemically. But appraiser bias, which is what we're trying to battle in my office, is where it could affect you anywhere. And most of these cases that you just saw on the other page, those are folks living in well-to-do neighborhoods. They're racially integrated neighborhoods, but their property value, their appraisal came back much lower than that of their neighbors. Again, it could be just a bad appraisal, but if we spot where they're looking at for the comparables, that's probably going to tell us what they're doing. If you want to file a complaint with our office, I have the website on here. All I say to you is the easiest thing is to Google Pennsylvania Department of State or Pennsylvania Appraiser Board. You're going to find our emails are way too long. You'll find a complaint form there. It's an online complaint form. And don't do it just because it's a discrimination complaint. If you believe it is discriminated against, say that, but also say, my appraisal is just bad. Also, by the way, all 28 other licensing boards use the same complaint form. So you have a bad doctor or anybody else like that, same place to complain. So one-stop shop for all the things that might happen to you with the licensed professional. If we receive a complaint about appraisal bias, we will then reach out to our friends at the PHRC and work with them to hopefully, or guide you to them so that you can actually get aid from both directions. Because we're going to look at the appraisal, they're going to look at trying to resolve things for you with the appraiser and or with the lender. Because remember, the lender is the one being protected here. Remember, I'm going back to the beginning. What do appraisals do? For the most part, they protect the lenders. And I got the PHRC's information on there as well. What are we trying to do to prevent all this? Education, education, education. We're mandating education. Fair housing has always been part of the education requirement, but now it's going to be much more specific. It's not in place yet because laws don't get passed overnight, especially regulations. But the state and federal agencies are all moving to add fair housing requirements to their requirements for training every 2 years. The Pennsylvania Real Estate Commission mandated a fair housing course in the last renewal period. But additionally, one of the positive things, one of the things that everybody will talk about when you read an article about appraisal bias is they'll tell you appraisers are a non-diverse group. I will tell you that the protected class I'm in, which hair might be an indication of that, I would be considered as kind of a young appraiser, okay? We need fresh blood in the appraisal community. And PAREA, P-A-R-E-A, one of the things right in the middle there, which has its own page coming up, is a very new and fabulous idea because remember I told you before, to become an appraiser, take a bunch of courses and then apprentice forever. What does that mean require to become an apprentice? Somebody willing to take you on. So 2 problems with that. One, areas where we have a diverse population might not have nearly as many appraisers willing to take on folks, especially because we have an aging appraisal population. They may not want to be a mentor to somebody for 2 to 3 years, maybe 4 years. And in some states, they can't find any. And also, if you have appraisers who have biases, and the older we are, the more biases we build up, again, more chance that they will pass. We do see a fruit of the poisonous tree with a lot of appraisers. Don't see it anymore. We got rid of most of those folks during the 2000s because it became very clear who was doing the improper appraisals once the crash occurred. We saw those where people were trained by poor appraisers and became poor appraisers themselves. PAREA is an online system with very high standards that's being prevented. You can get your education and then your experience through this program. Available everywhere, available to anybody. You don't have to have a specific mentor. There are mentors that work through the program, and you can get that experience, and they can go and create properties, virtual properties, that have things like a house that may have things that would let you know that by looking at it, it's probably owned by a black family, and see how that affects people. I'm hoping we actually get a remedial version of this later so we can train the folks that are in the field. But this is going to be something where they can do standardized training, make the training available to diverse populations, bring youth and diversity into the appraisal field to help out the costs. Because when costs go up, when supply is low, supply of houses is low, the supply of appraisers is low, that's going to be something where that would be very helpful with that. And you're going to get more standardized experiences for people. The first PAREA program has just been approved federally, and it's offered by the Appraisal Institute, and there's several others in the works. So that's the end of my presentation. I don't know if any of you want to be an appraiser, but you know anybody who might, it's going to be kind of cool to do it in the future, taking advantage of the current technology. And I believe we have a question back on the right.
Any questions? Oh, I'm sorry.
I can project.
I can hear you.
Thank you.
So just a clarification, can the quality of school districts be considered in evaluating people?
Equality, we do see, and it's one of our common things that we've seen in the past, is people defining the neighborhood as a school district. That is typically inappropriate. Now, there are some areas where I grew up, small town, that town is the school district. And the town's basically the size of a neighborhood in Philadelphia, because it's not that big. It's just 1 mile square. So there are cases where it clearly would be the neighborhood. That has been something for many years we've seen as a problem. And you'd see people when they would get higher prices sneaking into, quote unquote, and these are the kind of words you want to avoid, more desirable school districts. That's something we spotted for a long time. Now we're starting to connect that to the bias based on protected class. So we've always seen that, and it's always been a problem. Again, when I say always been a problem, we have 150 complaints a year about appraisers. There are at least, there's hard to pull statistics because nobody has a thing on how many mortgages are given out. But my best estimation based on numbers I pulled from the National Association of Realtors and from some of the mortgage lending places, because they do refinances as well, a couple 100,000 mortgages in Pennsylvania, either for sale, refinance, loan remodification, and we get 150 complaints. So the appraisers aren't doing a terrible job. It's probably underreported as far as appraisal bias goes, but we're trying to educate the public as well as the appraisers.
So just to be clear, that is not a good practice to consider the quality of the school district in the appraisal of it.
What will typically happen is if you're an appraiser, you don't have to worry about that because the buying public is doing that for you. Where it gets funky is when you're in an area, especially in like the suburbs of a large to a smaller city, where the school district lines, like where I live, I go in and out of 3 different school districts 5 minutes from my house. That can be very different because the neighborhoods are not homogeneous as far as school districts go then. And that's a place where we would watch that. Other places, the public who are buying have already raised the prices of what's considered to be, again, the quote unquote desirable school district because they are willing to pay more to live there. So that's one of those systemic things where the appraiser goes to the neighborhood, the values are raised because of the school district. The problem we look for is whether they're reaching out into places. Are they going into other school districts? Are they only going into this school district? This school district might be, this neighborhood's right on the corner of a school district, and all of their sales are in that school district. None of them are in the area that's right around it. That we would look for as illegal targeting, as we call it.
Thank you.
Thank you, it's a great question.
Any other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
In your opinion, how do you reverse the effects of redlining without the assistance of gentrification?
That's one of the reasons I wanted to present today was appraisal bias is often presented as this very simple thing. And if it was a very simple thing, we'd have an answer for it very quickly because it sounds like it's all appraisers doing this. But there is so much systemic backgrounds to it. And again, I saw that there was a young lady did a presentation on gentrification earlier and the proper ways to do it so that you're adding improvements without forcing folks out. I didn't attend that, but I want to attend that. I just saw the title and I want to attend that because that sounds exactly like what we need to do. That's what I wanted to present today was that this is a bigger and more complex problem than any news article will lead you to believe. There are some appraisers doing things they shouldn't be doing, and there's also appraisers doing things they should be doing, and in doing so, they are tainting their appraisal by appraisal bias, real estate related bias that long preceded and possibly even their entry into the field. Things like redlining and the effects that go forward with that. So yes, gentrification, all those improvements. I have no easy answer for you, and I do have one more question on the left. So just clarification, redlining is typically done by the banks, not the lenders. So that's been a loan thing. So that would actually not go to our office if there actually redlining going on. It would be on the folks giving credits out. All those settlements you've seen are with banks. There are no appraisers who are out there looking at red lines, but places get values that are lowered, places get reputations. It's that whole cycle. There's less value in the homes, there's less property taxes. How do we fund our schools? Through property taxes. So it gets to be that point. But what I would say, if you're looking at what you think might be a biased appraisal, is look and see, did that appraiser look for comparables in a close but geographically sensible area of houses that are actually like your own? Or were they cherry picking into certain areas that you know, because you live locally, might be more akin to the demographics of that area or closer to your own personal traits?
I'm sorry, please, if you have any more questions, please reach out. Sir, I know you came a long distance from here, and we really appreciate it. And as a small token of our appreciation, we would like you to have this, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank all of you for all of the questions. I really appreciate it, and they made a much better presentation. Thank you.
Thanks again, and I'll leave it to Director
All right,
Garcia.
yes, glasses right there.
All right, so we can let everyone else in as we wrap this up. How have you enjoyed the conference? So, yeah, y'all can come in. We're done in here. We're not going to keep you out. So it's important for us at the commission to highlight something, and that is partnerships are going to help the effort, right? And so I will call, for example, Ray is one person that we're partnering up on looking at appraisal bias. So we're doing some fair housing training within their offices. Please come in, have a seat. Just kind of warming up the crowd for you. And so we're partnering up with them on the appraisal board. I've attended a couple of appraisal board meetings and also saw the new initiatives where they're extending the educational hours and requirements to include fair housing education. They did that last month. It'll become effective, I believe, and Ray can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it becomes effective 2025, if I'm not mistaken. There's just a lot of stuff that's going on that it's just the way the timetable worked out. But it leaves an opening for us to be able to work with them on providing education within that industry. Additionally, we are partnering up with the Department of Insurance, and we saw representation from them. They were here earlier today. I think they still may be here. Bethany might still be here. And we're partnering up with them, again, giving some training within the Department of Insurance, but also preparing trainings for brokers across the Commonwealth. Had I had more of that training, because I went through insurance, and Gloria knows this is true, how much fair housing did we get in our insurance classes? I mean, very little, other than the situation that Nationwide presented, which then made it mandatory. But even when we started looking at the NAIC, we noticed that they really didn't have anything for that for training. Yes, come on in. We're just kind of wrapping it up. Come on in. And so partnerships is the key, and we're also partnering up with the Department of Community and Economic Development for the same thing. They've exposed and allowed us to train all of their grantees on fair housing and affirmatively furthering fair housing and the role that they play in that. I say all this because, this is a call to action summary that we're doing today. We've talked a lot about neighboring. We've talked a lot about, the trauma behind housing. We've made the connections and correlation within housing, health, domestic violence. Everything has a connection. We heard our keynote talk about how everything was wrapped around housing for him, including immigration, including domestic violence. So there's no doubt that it takes a Herculean partnership effort. And as an enforcement agency, it's odd for us to be in a situation where we can both be the enforcement entity and be a partner. This is why I like what E.D. Lassiter is doing when he hired a policy director, when he's looking at a civil rights division, because that's going to allow us the ability to actually go out without compromising our neutrality and be able to make some of these partnerships that are very necessary in the work we do. A lot of this is policy. A lot of this is stuff that we need to take care of. And the only way we do it is by getting into those conference rooms and having that one-on-one difficult discussions like the ones that I'm having. Those uncomfortable discussions. I've gotten very comfortable having uncomfortable discussions, but it's just that first discussion. And after that, we continue. So that's what the PHRC is doing in terms of partnerships and what we're doing from the Fair Housing Division. I also want to say this to you. As you leave this conference, I want you to think about, what can I be doing? Who can I partner with? Because you might think that one individual doesn't make a difference, but one individual can change the world. If that one individual needs support, then they need to know who they can partner with to do that. So that is the key, is the partnerships. I think it's what's been missing. I mentioned today during the housing huddle that everyone kind of sat on their hands and they assumed that HUD was solely responsible for affirmatively furthering fair housing. That's the way the law is written. And so people read it and that's the way it is. But when you start seeing that funding stream, you realize that so many of these agencies and municipalities have a direct responsibility to play. And as someone said earlier today, you think that us politicians, we're politicians that we know this stuff, but we don't. So as you leave this conference today, think about, how can I spread the word? Commit to speaking to one person of consequence. Attend a meeting, share the information. That's my ask of you. I also want to say this. If you are interested in receiving the presentations today, please see me and be prepared to give me your business card, and we'll make sure that you get those, okay? It's important that you get those. Other than that, I want to thank the members of the subcommittee, the Philadelphia Regional Office. Thank you so much. Please give them a warm round of applause. Putting one of these together is not easy, as I'm sure some of my colleagues working on the disability conference will note. So it's important to have a very motivated and active and leadership-oriented team like the one we had here. So I want to thank all of you for your hard work, for your diligence, for being there, and just kind of, I came here and really everything got assigned and all I had to do was check a couple of things. But for the most part, we called audibles all during the day and we made it work. So thank you. Please, round of applause for Renessa, who took the leadership in the MC space. And Todd Schwartz as well. I mean, how tough was Todd's job? Brittany left on parental leave, and Todd took over. That's how tough that job is. Because working with me is not easy. It's an acquired taste. I know that Todd probably thinks I'm crazy sometimes, but there's a method to the madness. But thank you, Todd, for putting up with it. And then all of the members of Samantha Lopez, Taiwan Martinez, thank you for your diligence. I want to thank all of our presenters, Rachel, Abraham, there's so many to mention. I don't have my program here, but please know that I carry you with me. I thank you. Your contributions all came together. I look out here at Chad Fry. The neighboring, that when I first sat down, and this was 2 weeks ago, mind you, sat down and talked to Chad Fry, and he talked to me about neighboring. I read his white paper, and I said, this is affirmatively furthering fair housing in action. That's what he's putting together. And that's what he's doing he didn't even talk about his municipal challenge. He didn't even talk about that. But there are municipalities that are being challenged to use the neighboring concept. And so I said to him, I said, well, you know what? If you tell them this is a way that you can satisfy the AFFH requirement because it's gradual and it's intentional, you can use that. And so I'm looking forward to big things and more challenges across municipalities. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Again, if you want a copy of all the presentations, please see us. Also, scan the QR code and take the survey. It's intuitive. A lot of the stuff that we did this year is because people took those surveys, they provided information, and the subcommittee saw it through. So again, thank you all. Thank you for coming. You are now able to self-tour the museum from now until 4 p.m. Okay, so take a look at all the exhibition and visit the souvenir shop as well. Thank you. I will leave you with the words from PHRC Speaks. Until next time, take care, be good, and be fair to each other.